We're very excited to host a best practices on virtual instruction by our provost and a panel of faculty members.
And hi, everybody. My name is Aguilera. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction over at Kremen. I'm joining you all from my apartment on occupied Yokuts and Mono lands on which I am grateful to be allowed to live and work, and whose diverse tribal communities continue to share stewardship. Next slide. Today, I'll be going a little bit more general to share about how the principle of less grading, better teaching plays out in my own pedagogy, particularly for online courses. Now, in a world, next slide. In a world beyond this emergency remote teaching situation, I would be happy to debate the merits of grading from a philosophical and empirical perspective. But given the current reality in which we find ourselves, I'm going to just ground this talk in a few assumptions. Next slide. Assumption one is that grading, defined as the act of evaluating student work, can be very time-consuming. Assumption number two, as Dr. Ross highlighted earlier, grades don't always provide meaningful feedback to students. And this is grounded in assumption number three, which is meaningful feedback is that which actually helps students identify and improve on specific aspects of their work. Next slide. I find it helpful to think about grading and feedback in the context of this important ratio, first introduced to me through the work of Dan Meyer, former California high school math teacher. Dan argues that the worth of any instructional decision comes down to the ratio of how much impact it has on student learning compared to how much time you, as a teacher, spend on it. It's one of the reasons why I tend to keep things fairly straightforward in my online teaching. Next slide. So if these assumptions hold true for your particular teaching situation, how can we spend less time grading and more time teaching? Here are three things that I've done, along with relevant readings and references for anybody who wants to dig deeper. Next slide. The first approach I'll share has been attributed to English professor and author Peter Albo, although I didn't really reflect on its value in online teaching until I trained under Michelle Pacansky-Brock's model of humanizing online teaching and learning. Next slide. The basic idea is that by going from a complicated multi-point rubric to a fairly streamlined checklist of just the essentials, you accomplish a few things. Next slide. From a teacher perspective, the practice of grading shifts from nitpicking over levels of rubric performance to simply going down the line with a yes, you did the thing, or no, you did not do the thing. Even more importantly, it frees up valuable time and energy that you can use, next slide, to write a bit of, and you'll have to click because I messed up the animations, to write a bit of qualitative feedback to students that actually points out for each student, points each student in the right direction for next time. So here, what you have in front of you is an example of qualitative feedback I was able to share in Canvas. And you'll see highlighted in red that mine is just one of several pieces of feedback students receive through the peer review function on Canvas. Next slide. Now, to make sure a next time actually exists, I pair this checklist approach with a revise and resubmit policy such that if a student doesn't like the grade they got, they can fix up their work based on my feedback and resubmit for a replacement grade. Then I don't worry about giving a student an 80 or 60 out of 100. If they feel bad, they can just resubmit. Next slide. Taken to its extreme form, this practice leads me to the second approach I'll talk about today, and that is ungraded assignments. Next slide. The basic idea is that in some cases, I create activities in my online courses that are simply not tied to a grade, whether that is through online surveys set to automatically give full credit for submission, or activities like peer review, for which I simply do not create a graded assignment inside Canvas. Next slide. I found this particularly useful for discussion boards, which frees up time for me to actually join into those discussions, which was something that students specifically asked for from me before I made this change. Next slide. And this leads us to the final practice I will share today, which is regularly collecting feedback on your teaching. What this actually looks like for me in Canvas is a weekly learning log activity in which my online students take a quiz that I have set to graded survey in the Canvas settings so that it automatically gives them credit for full submission. Next slide. There are 5 open-ended items on the learning logs, some of which are course specific, but the one today I'll focus on is called the muddiest point. Next slide. The item reads, what is one idea you found unclear, confusing, or otherwise challenging from last week's content or lecture? And while students might not always have a muddiest point to share every week, this practice allows them to ask questions without any of their classmates knowing, a few of which I can then choose to address anonymously to the entire class. Once again, the time I spend not grading frees up myself to decide how to clarify any confusion as we move forward. Next slide. One final caveat I want to make is that these are just examples of teaching practices that fit into a much broader digital pedagogy that guides all of my online courses. And so, as with any educational approach, your mileage may vary. However, if you are interested, next slide, in reducing the time you spend grading in order to improve the time you spend providing feedback, engaging discussions, and clarifying confusion, aka teaching, then I hope these 3 practices are useful. Please reach out if you want to talk more about this or any other teaching-related stuff, and thank you for your time.